Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Atlantic Institute's event on Bridging the Political Divide. We have with us Scott Segrest from the Citadel, Todd Shaw from USC, R Olsen from Clemson, Professor Bill Lasser from Clemson, all here with us to share tonight. Before we get started, though, my name is Christina. I forgot if I said that. And I'm the host for the evening, and I'm going to share with you all, I'm going to share my screen and share a short video about Atlantic Institute. I just want to make sure everybody is muted while I do this, because I can't go back since I'm sharing my screen and mute anybody. But I'm going to share my screen and just share a short video about what Atlantic Institute is about. And then we'll come back and get started. And so here we go.
The Atlantic Institute is a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting harmonious coexistence between peoples of various cultures, faiths, and backgrounds. We seek this goal through peaceful dialogue, education initiatives, and community organization. Our dialogue events bring together experts, community and faith leaders, and knowledge seekers to address social issues that affect us all. We feel dialogue is the most important element in peaceful coexistence, so we try and maintain several panel discussions, TED Talk events, and book clubs throughout the year. These events touch on social issues, race relations, and cultural understanding, and are a mainstay of our programming. The Atlantic Institute's education events are extremely important to our mission of understanding. We want to promote socially forward critical thinking to students of all ages. To that end, we have developed programs that seek to grow the creative spirit of students and help them think about their communities and the world around them. Our Future Leaders of Dialogue event brings together nominated elite students to learn from each other as well as political and business leaders. Our art and essay contest gives students a theme about important societal issues and allows them to create wonderful works of art and writing while steering their minds towards improving their world. We're always seeking ways to educate youths and adults in order to make a peaceful world for all of us. Our community events are designed to transform neighbors into friends and groups of people into a community. By associating with other nonprofits or by our own initiative, we are always trying to discover new avenues to improve our neighborhoods, places of worship, and community centers. We host cooking demonstrations of food from other cultures, work with various nonprofits to help elevate the work of others, and try to find a way to make the lives of those who are disenfranchised or marginalized better. Building a more peaceful world starts in our backyards, so we are dedicated to improving our communities and associations. The Atlantic Institute is always seeking like-minded volunteers and collaborators. If you would like to learn more, find volunteer opportunities, or just want to chat with our staff, please visit our website at www.atlanticinstitutesc.org or follow us on Facebook. We will never run out of fun, educational, peaceful events, so come join us to help make this world a better place full of understanding and unity.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that we get that tonight we're coming together to discuss bridging this political divide that we find ourselves in. And the mainstay of Atlantic Institute is to build bridges of understanding. And when all of us got together, the panelists and myself and the EMS moderator got together the other day, we really touched on that subject a lot. We're looking to build bridges here. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the evening over to Scott Segrest, again, who's with the Citadel. I'll let him tell you a little bit about himself and then let him just take it away. Thank you, Scott. And just if you could unmute yourself. Yep, you're muted. There you go.
Good now? Okay.
Yep, you're good.
Yeah, I'm Scott Segrest. I teach political science at the Citadel. Focus on political theory, and but I teach American politics and political ideologies and things like that. Our topic is bridging the political divide, and I just wanted to point out a couple of maybe things to think about to kind of get us in the right frame of mind to have a discussion here. And then I'll introduce our other panelists and the questions that they've each provided discussion questions based on their areas of expertise that we'll go through. But I wanted to suggest, first of all, thinking about getting us in a frame of mind, I think we need to acknowledge the difficulty of the situation. I mean, the political divide is deep, right? Emotions are running high, and something I'd like to highlight. There's a lot of mutual incomprehension. I think we don't understand how those guys think that way, how they can support those people, how they can support those positions. And so it's I think we're kidding ourselves if we think we're going to have unity overnight from one conversation. That's not going to happen, right? So we got a tall task to tackle. So how do we discuss these things? Our panelists are going to talk about what they're going to provide us, some key areas to discuss. I want to just make a quick suggestion about how we might be able to most fruitfully discuss these things. And I'll make two brief suggestions. First of all, I think I would put this in terms of, for the purposes of a discussion, we have to put ourselves out of the frame of mind of advocacy. Let me give you an illustration of what I have in mind. Imagine a courtroom. You have attorneys on two sides, right? Each of them, their job is to defeat the other side, right? They're advocates. They're pushing for a position. They are not there to learn from each other, right? They're not there for a conversation. If your lawyer ever at a trial says, you know what, the lawyer on the other side has a really good point. I mean, I think my client may actually be wrong here on this point. That's a bad attorney, right? You don't want to keep that attorney. That's perfectly appropriate in a courtroom, right? That's the way it's done. The point is to win, and you're probably not going to point out to the other side where things that could help them, right? It's different in a conversation. This is what I want to the point I want to make. If you want to have a conversation, at least for the purpose of the conversation, you want to not try to win, right? Defeat the other person, but to ask honest questions, not presupposing you already know the answer, right? You want to listen with an aim to learn something. You want to be willing to be questioned yourself and maybe question some of your own assumptions. That's the kind of discussion you have with a friend as opposed to an opponent, right? So there's a time and a place for advocacy. What I'm suggesting is, maybe for the purposes of our discussion, maybe set that aside for a little while and just think about what can we learn from each other. That's the second point I wanted to suggest. Is we talked about the panel members and the other day talked about how do we find common ground, because it seems like in some ways we can't find any at all. And I just want to suggest this in relation to what I just said. Maybe a common quest for understanding is a beginning of a common ground, right? If we are making the effort to understand each other, that's a kind of common that very attempt. So I just say that to kind of maybe help people thinking about how to approach all this. Now let me go to our panel members. First of all, we have Professor Todd Shaw, who is at the University of South Carolina. He's been on faculty there since 2003 and has appointments both in the Department of Political Science and the African American Studies program. He was appointed to the College of Arts and Science Distinguished Associate Professor of Political Science and African American Studies by Dean Mary Ann Fitzpatrick in August of 2012. He served as the interim chair and then chair of the Department of Political Science from 2017 to 2019. Currently, he is the interim associate dean for diversity, equity, and inclusion and the social sciences in the College of Arts and Sciences. He researches and teaches broadly in the areas of African American politics, urban politics, and public policy, as well as citizen activism and social movements. His most recent is a co-edited volume, After Obama, African American Politics in a Post-Obama Era by New York University Press. And here's Professor Shaw's discussion question. How have the divisions around race and racial politics contributed to political polarization, especially in the last 12 years? Will the racial divide simply worsen over time, thus worsening partisan divides, or is there some hope that we may turn a corner soon? Now, Professor William Lasser is our next panelist. He is the alumni distinguished professor of political science and the executive director of the Honors College at Clemson University. His research interests include the role of the Supreme Court in American politics and American political development, particularly the New Deal and the expansion of the American state. For many years, he has taught courses in American constitutional law, American politics, and political theory. His books include The Limits of Judicial Power, published by the University of North Carolina Press, and Benjamin V. Cohen, Architect of the New Deal, for Yale University Press. Professor Lasser's discussion question is, has or how has the Supreme Court contributed to the polarization of American politics? Our last but not least professor for our panelists is Professor Laura R. Olsen. She is the Thurman Professor of Political Science and Director of the PhD program in Political Studies at Clemson University. She has been a U.S. Fulbright Scholar to Italy, President of the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, and Editor-in-Chief for the Journal of the Scientific Study of Religion. Her research focuses on contemporary religion and politics, with emphasis on public opinion and civic engagement. Her work has appeared in scholarly journals, including Political Research Quarterly and Social Science Quarterly. She has also published 9 books, most recently, Religion and Politics in America, Faith, Culture, and Strategic Choices, with Routledge Press in 2018. Professor Olsen's discussion question is, how and why might religious freedom be a significant reason why Americans are politically polarized today? So we have a good range of topics there to tackle our issue. So we'll go ahead and start with Professor Shaw then. Professor Shaw.
All right. Thank you so very much. I appreciate it. And my thanks to Christina Bell and the Atlantic Institute for this invitation. I really appreciate it. And I'm very happy to join this panel. I just have to say this as a fun point of South Carolina rivalry. In my gallery view, I have Clemson to the left of me and to the right of me, but I'm happy to be on this panel with them today because I think we're going to be talking about something quite compelling. And certainly the USC-Clemson divide is not a bigger divide than the political divide. So again, I'm happy to join my colleagues today on this panel. Let me just right. Let me just take a moment, and I have some slides to share with you, but I'm not going to share all of these slides. I'm just going to hit some high points in several minutes, and then certainly leave the balance of the time to my co-panelists and to our discussion. So I want to talk about this issue of the political divide with regards to race. And I'm going to try and keep the tagline of my comments simple, which is sort of what is this? What are the ways in which, as my question asks, how does race fuel this political divide? And what can we do about it? Is there any prospect of bridging that divide? By the way, I think I might have closed caption on, so if you see it at the bottom, that's fine. All righty. So let me start with a definition of political polarization that I think is most useful for our purposes. And really what we're talking about is affective polarization. And by affective polarization, what we're really talking about is affect or emotion, right? So it's sort of a mutual partisan antipathy expressed by Democrats and Republicans, the US. And this antipathy is not just that Republicans and Democrats, or more broadly conservatives and liberals sort of disagree or bitterly disagree, but it goes even further than that. Individuals within political parties now dislike each other, have antipathy toward each other. And there's a whole wealth of literature and political science around this question of polarization. But certainly one leading theory is this idea that now the identity of Republican and Democrat is not just simply a divide roughly around being conservative and being liberal, but these are containers for a whole host of identity alignments. From, as Professor Olsen will suggest, certain religion plays a big role in this now, and the way in which religion is now lining up with race, as lining up with class. So there's sort of this mutual antipathy of they're not like us. Well, race correlates with this antipathy. And this work is coming principally from the work of Nicholas Valentino and his colleague that show that affective polarization or racial resentment went along with this affective polarization. And so what this graphic is simply indicating is that at lower levels of the belief among respondents in this experimental design, if they said that, well, generally speaking, we identified those who sort of identified the Democratic Party as being more predominantly white, and the respondents who said the Republican Party was more predominantly Black, at the percentile, or their belief, pardon me, that they believed that was sort of the roughly, roughly the parties fell along those lines in terms of racial identification. Their sort of racial resentment, if you will, was a little flatlined. But as those percentiles went up, and they said, well, no, the Democrats is more predominantly a party among African Americans, than the Republican Party is a party more directly among whites, then that racial resentment ticked upwards. And so in some ways, this sense of that the party is unlike us, and by the way, I'm sorry, this is among white respondents. So that sense of that party is of the other race or group correlates with that affective polarization. And so in some ways, racial resentment and resentment around political differences correlate with each other, according to Valentino and his colleague. Is changing racial, ethnic, or demographic fueling this conflict? Well, we certainly can talk about it as an aspect of that conflict. But by 2025, and I'm sure you've heard of these figures, that the US will no longer have a racial or ethnic majority group. In other words, the United States will be like California, somewhere around 46, 47, 48% white, and then all the other sort of groups sort of filling in that percentage, with particularly, of course, Hispanics or Latino populations increasingly becoming a larger and larger minority within that non-majority sort of groupings. And then sort of the degree to which immigration might be fueling this affective polarization. I would argue that in some ways, again, that the demographic changes are a portion of this polarization. But really what's fueling this polarization more directly is an ongoing sense of polarization that stems from many decades prior that we have not yet overcome, and has only become, that level of divide stagnating does not help the racial divide, that does not help the political divide. And that divide is the divide of racial segregation, which brings about social segregation. So William Fry, in a recent study with the Metropolitan Policy Program said, recently the US Census Bureau released its 2013-2017 American Community Survey, a 5-year estimate. And the data shows that Black-white neighborhood segregation varies widely across metropolitan areas and has declined only modestly since the beginning of this century, since the 2000s. Most of the white residents of large metropolitan areas live in neighborhoods that remain overwhelmingly white. And while Black neighborhoods have become more diverse, this is largely due to an increase in Hispanic rather than white residents. So along the lines of Richard Rothstein's thinking about the color of law, and I'm more persuaded as I've studied this as a student of racial and ethnic politics in the US, that it is really the sources of the residential segregation that only increases our social segregation and our social and political segregation or political distance. Now, and if you look at this from the standpoint of the racial or ethnic makeup of neighborhoods, particularly within the larger metropolitan areas, even since the 2000s or the early 2000s and now our current period, you've seen some movement in that whites live in modestly less white neighborhoods, but still overwhelmingly or more predominantly white. And Black and Latino residents live in neighborhoods that, again, fall more along these lines of fewer whites and more co-ethnics or those of a similar minority group. Now, we'll come back to this point, but it's not just sort of physical or residential segregation, because if you look at the sort of segregation indices, some of what these dots are saying is, well, the North in some way is more residentially segregated by these dissimilarity indices, as is true of the South. Well, the South, having a larger African-American and to some degree Latino population in certain areas, means that, yes, folk don't have as large as physical distance in between them, but they certainly have social and cultural differences that you and I both know have been the case over many a decade. And so it's not just residential segregation, but residential segregation does not help. And even in these southern cities, we're having sort of rates of 50% or higher in terms of this segregation. All right, I'm going to go through the next couple of slides quickly. So I'm going to suggest to you that this physical and social segregation fuels perceptions of the other group that lends themselves to racial and ethnic stereotypes. Most the Pew Center had data that says most Blacks say someone has acted suspicious of them as if they weren't smart, and so people acted like they were suspicious of them. Again, with each of these indicators, you see African Americans. Not always the group to feel the brunt of that stereotype, but more frequently, particularly given the Black-white segregation divide. People acted like they thought they weren't smart, had been treated unfairly, or hiring or promotion, been unfairly stopped by the police, fear of their personal safety, been subject to slurs or jokes. This is not given the recent Asian and anti-Asian violence against Asian and Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. This is not, you and I both know this is not a coincidence in terms of the animus toward Asian and Asian American populations. Then people assume they were racist or prejudiced. Whites feeling that more distinctly than racial and ethnic minorities. Again, sort of the ways in which these social distances create stereotypes about the other groups, or physical distance, social distance, stereotypes, and then interest distance. To what degree, whether it be the policing system, the criminal justice system, hiring, promotions, mortgage lending, across all of these scores, the ways in which African Americans feel that they are treated differently than are their white counterparts. And there is certainly data to back up this being more than just perception. So let me get into the political differences that reinforce this affective and racial polarization. To say that, well, this, as you and I both know, that this divide between Democrats and Republicans is a recent phenomenon. Of course it's not. That's the function of political party systems. But that race maps onto political party as in the way it does, as it has over the last 40 years, is not coincidental as well. And so at least since 1972, and we can come back to this, whites more predominantly voting for the Republican candidate, and then African Americans, Hispanics, and Asian Americans, certainly by the early 2000s, a majority of racial and ethnic minorities voting Democratic. And so there is clear sort of racial division in those political party divides. And as you and I both know, the 2000 election only heightened or gave continued reason for that divide between candidate Trump and candidate Biden. Then certainly the political and social structures, and my co-panelists will certainly get into the institutional logic of this divide. But the U.S. Senate is a very unrepresentative ethnic and racial body by ethnic and racial diversity. The racial makeup of Congress, how it would differ if allotted as a percentage of the U.S. population. So, so Hispanic or Latino, American Indian, and Black, this is what it actually looks like: 3 Black senators and many fewer Asian American and no American Indian as of sort of the most recent Congress. This is what it should look like if it was demographically representative. And so the Senate is really the most, among the most unrepresentative racially and ethnic bodies in the United States, in many regards. How do we bridge this divide? Real quickly, let me just say this, because we can certainly contribute more to this discussion. But let me say the Atlantic Institute has long been on to the secret of chipping at this this boulder, which is to create political community, which is about creating political trust. I want to give a bit of a shout out to our own work at the University of South Carolina with our collaborative on race led by Professor Jennifer Gunter, that the degree to which folk can engage in dialogue, as Professor Segrest said at the very beginning of this program, the degree to which we can seek degrees of understanding to break down even given our physical distances, to break down those social distances and cultural distances are key. Because in some ways then to understand the other side, to understand the other perspective, means it lends itself less to stereotype and more to understanding, less to divided sense of interest, no matter what the actual policy effect might be, and more to let's see if in fact some commonality is possible. Let me stop it there, and certainly I'll be happy to engage in our Q&A.
Thank you very much, Professor Shaw. That was very enlightening. I certainly appreciated that. I just want to interject that thought. Just thought I would share. If Scott, I know you're hosting. I'm sorry, I jumped in.
I said Professor Lasser, but then I realized I was on mute again. So please, Professor Lasser, take it away.
Thank you. And I want to echo Professor Shaw's thanks to Christina Bell and the Atlantic Institute. And I'm really delighted to see faculty from the different institutions across the state. I think sometimes we do let the football rivalry get in the way of what really is important, which I think is the more we talk to each other across the great faculties that we have and great students, the better. So I want to talk a little bit about this question of how our dialogue about controversial issues affects polarization. There are many causes of polarization. Dr. Shaw's talked about some of them. Dr. Olsen will talk about religion and other things too. And we'll get to perhaps others as the questions and the answers come along. But political division in America, even hot and heated division, is not anything new. I sometimes console myself by thinking that there have been periods in American history that have looked a lot like this in terms of the divide across the aisle. We can always think about 1800 and the election between the Federalists at that time and the Jeffersonian Republicans. I mean, they were viciously opposed to each other. And of course, in 1860, the political system wasn't even capable of holding the country together and resulting in the Civil War. And we've seen controversies throughout American history, but I think what I want to talk about is the role of the Constitution and particularly constitutional law in shaping how we think about these issues. And what I think is important to understand is that the biggest controversies in American history, the issues that have really divided the nation, as Alexis de Tocqueville observed almost 200 years ago, have always turned into legal questions, constitutional questions framed as legal questions. So just to give you a couple of examples, and there aren't that many episodes in American history where we were really either literally or figuratively at each other's throats. But if you think about the constitutional issue that ultimately provoked the Civil War, it was the Dred Scott case, right? And the Supreme Court took on that case in 1857, and from there it was really a pretty steady march to the dissolution of the country and the resulting war. And again, in the 1930s, when Franklin Roosevelt proposed the New Deal, radical restructuring of the relationship of power between the national government and the states and between the national government and the private sector, that issue too became a major constitutional question, a series of constitutional questions. Something like 14 of the New Deal laws were struck down by the Supreme Court between 1933 and 1937 before the court finally gave in the wake of the 1936 election and the threat of the court packing plan, and the Supreme Court switched sides, the famous switch in time that saved 9, and then the New Deal was approved, and we kind of moved on to new issues. I think what has changed and what's really, I think, remarkable about the modern era is that virtually every question that we talk about, every question that we are divided about, has become a legal and constitutional question. I spent literally a couple minutes jotting down a few of these issues that are not only controversies and important political issues for us to think about and for us perhaps to disagree about, that's okay, but that have also become constitutional and legal questions. I'll give you a few examples. Civil rights, pretty obvious one. We had, going back to the 1950s especially, Brown v. Board of Education, but then a series of even still contemporary issues on voting rights, on affirmative action, many more. Privacy, contraception in the 1960s, abortion beginning in the 1970s, sexual freedoms, the rights of gay and lesbian LGBTQ people. First Amendment questions involving speech, libel, which is back in the news, with some saying we should relax federal restrictions on libel. One appellate judge, recently saying that the Supreme Court's libel decisions of the 1960s should be reconsidered. Questions of obscenity or pornography, incitement, which was something we've heard about in the last few months. Questions of religion, I'll defer to Dr. Olsen, but certainly constitutional questions on exemptions for religious observers and religious groups, on the limits of state funding and federal funding of religion, even in the recent pandemic, on whether states could limit the size of worship services in order to promote the public health. Second Amendment questions on guns, which after the Heller decision about 10 or 15 years ago, the question of individual gun ownership is now a recognized constitutional right. So every gun question is now a legal question. Every gun policy question, every gun control question is a question of federal constitutional law. States' rights, as advocates of states' rights like to call it. I had a professor who insisted states have powers, but they don't have rights, but that itself was evocative of the controversy. States' rights not only echoing back to segregation and slavery, but even in other contexts too. We've seen a lot with voting and the power of states to regulate their own elections, or the power of particular state legislatures to regulate their elections. And of course, we know that under the Affordable Care Act, states sued successfully that the Medicaid expansion could not be mandated by the federal government. the separation of powers questions. The entire Trump presidency was one legal and constitutional question after another. From the earliest days of the Trump presidency, when we had, of course, the question of the Muslim ban, as it was called, through the questions of children at the border, questions about DACA, questions about presidential subpoenas, and whether presidential aides could be subpoenaed by Congress, on and on and on. All of those turn into constitutional questions. Workers' rights, a case heard by the court this week on whether unions had the right to meet or unions had the right to go into private businesses onto their property and organize, and whether that was constitutional. Workers' rights, but also as framed in that case, the rights of business owners. And so I could go on, but I think you get the point. It's difficult to come up with any issue that we care about that has not been framed as a legal or constitutional question. So you might ask, so what? What's so bad about that? Well, the problem with questions becoming legal questions in general, but constitutional questions in particular, is I think two things. The first is when you raise a question to the level of constitutional law, you infuse it with questions of morality as well. Our Constitution has always been held up as a kind of higher law. And it's very difficult to think about something like First Amendment rights outside of the constitutional questions. When people say, and I've had this conversation with many students in constitutional law classes and many friends and people I talk to, they'll say, the government isn't allowed to do, they can't do that, that's unconstitutional. I'll say, well, actually, if you look at this case, and this case, they can do that. And then people say, well, it's wrong, they shouldn't be allowed to do that. The Constitution should be changed, or it should be interpreted a different way. Because it's very hard to separate the intensity and passion with which we hold moral questions from the nature of those constitutional questions. And secondly, and I think this is particularly appropriate to in the context of the topic for tonight, when you turn a question into a legal question, it becomes very difficult to compromise on that question. It becomes very difficult first because it's related to my first point. If it's a moral issue, then we're not going to compromise. If it's a question of policy, what should the state's response be to the pandemic? Should they allow movie theaters to open? Should they allow restaurants? Should they allow 25% capacity at the churches? Well, if we discuss those questions as policy questions, we might find some common ground. I think the movie theater should be open at 100%. You think they should be closed? Well, we'll allow 50%. We can find some kind of common ground. But when I say you can't close my church down because I have a constitutional right to worship with as many people as I want to, I'm not compromising on that question. I can't compromise on that question. And there's no real incentive for you to compromise if you're on the other side of that question, because I'm going to go to court and say, I have a right to this. And as Professor Segrest said in his comment, the other side's going to go to court and say, no, we're right, we win, we can do whatever we want to do. And so there's very little incentive or motivation to compromise on that question. It delegitimates the center because anyone who proposes a compromise is immediately attacked from both sides. If I say, why don't we let 50% of people attend the church service? The religious groups aren't happy. They're going to yell at me for being against religious freedom. But the public health groups aren't going to be happy either. They're going to yell at me and say, why are you allowing this pandemic to continue, right? So middle ground positions are delegitimated. The more extreme positions on either side are given much more force. And by the end of the day, if you take it from the political arena to the judicial arena, and I know all my colleagues would agree that the courts are political too, but they're political in a different way. Once you take an issue from Congress or from the White House or from the states and put it in the Supreme Court, there will be winners and there will be losers. Once in a while, there's a compromise, like Chief Justice Roberts came up with to kind of allow the Affordable Care Act to be legal, even though he struck it down. He said it could be a tax, even though it couldn't be a regulation. But most of the time, those compromises just simply don't happen. and the polarization then continues. And each victory then encourages the victorious side to bring the next lawsuit because they can win again. And each defeat sort of inspires the losing side to come back to court and maybe take to the streets, but to vindicate the rights that they've perceived that they've lost. The cases the issues that cause the most problems in the American political system historically really became what we call sometimes critical issues, or they led to these very intense and very meaningful elections like 1936 when FDR was reelected, or 1860 when Lincoln was elected. They really took on that intensity because of the Supreme Court's decisions in the Dred Scott case and in many of the New Deal cases. And so the court contributed to that polarization, but it was limited to a set of very important issues. I mean, you can't get much more important than slavery. In the 1930s, you can't get much more important than the state of the economy at that point. So not to minimize those issues in any way, but there were lots of other issues out there that we could find compromise on. Sometimes we look back and say we shouldn't have compromised on those issues. It was wrong to do so. FDR compromised on race, for example, in order to get his economic agenda. So we don't have to agree with that compromise, but compromise was at least an option. And I think I'll close with just an anecdote. I was talking to a group of students a year or so ago. They were all, as it happens, fairly, I would say, Democrats in political orientation. And I said to them, look, suppose you were a United States Senator and I'm Mitch McConnell, and somehow I say to you, look, okay, I know you guys really care about all these issues. Pick the most important one. And one of them said, well, it's DACA. I said, okay, I'm gonna get my Republican caucus to vote with you and to vindicate the rights, guarantee the rights of all these DACA children who were brought over to this country. I said, but you gotta give me something. What issue are you gonna give up? And they didn't come up with one. Could not find one. Every time someone suggested one, no, that wasn't gonna work. And every one of those is a moral and constitutional issue. So I'll close with that and turn it back to Scott.
Great, thank you, Dr. Lasser. Dr. Olsen, please take it away.
Thank you. And I'd like to also echo what my colleagues had to say about the Atlantic Institute. Thank you ever so much to all of you for the invitation. See if I can find the right word in my brain here. For the invitation, it's a joy to be part of this conversation. So I thought I'd actually share a few slides as well. And the one that I want to start with in particular, I think, one second here, pause for tech. Sorry. Here we go. I think this one will really sort of set a tone for what I want to talk about. So more generally, if you take a look at this particular little bit of survey data from last fall, I think goes a long way in framing what we might conclude to be the relationship between religion, broadly construed, and political polarization in general. And at the end of the day, I'd like to argue that a big piece of what is driving white Christians to be on one side politically and everybody else, of course, this is not a perfect relationship, but generally speaking in the aggregate, as I'll show you in the next slide, white Christians to be on one side politically and everybody else to be on the other side politically. A big piece of what's driving that is a sense among particularly white evangelicals that something that they treasure, something that has always sort of been in their minds protected, and that is their ability to do what they want to do around religion, to exercise religious freedom, to go back to a term that Professor Lasser introduced, religious freedom, is being compromised. And so what we see here in this Pew slide, this little table, is you can very plainly see of Americans who feel that they've been harassed or bullied online, 3 in 10 white evangelicals assert that the reason for that bullying was their religion. Compare that number, if you will, to even white non-evangelical, right? So that's white people who are Protestant, but not evangelical Protestant. Maybe 1 in 10 say that religion has been the reason for that sort of bullying that they've faced. Likewise, Catholics, only 15%, right? So half the number, half the share of Catholics, if we compare to white evangelicals. Then notice down there toward the bottom, atheists. Atheists actually comprise a very small sector of the US population, but 21% of them say that bullying has been targeted against them as a result of their, in this case, non-religion. So what this suggests is
Dr. Olsen,
something, yes.
let me just interject for 1 second. I can't see the bottom of your slide. I don't know why I can't see. It stops at white non-evangelical, like at the number 11.
Let's
So
see.
that, yeah, that might work. I just want to make sure, because I know you were like, oh wait, and I'm like, no, I can't see it. And
Is
I know
this
we
better?
all, yes, that works.
Oh, actually, that's the wrong slide.
That's
Does
the wrong
this,
one. That one, yes, there you go.
can you see the whole thing now?
Yep, I can see the whole thing now.
Okay, good. If I make it a little bigger, you still see
That
the whole
works.
thing?
Yep.
Okay, great. Sorry. So 19% in total of Americans say that they've been bullied online for some reason. Roughly a third of people who are white evangelicals say that it's been because of their religion. Likewise, 21% of those who are atheists say that it's been because of their religion. So what this shows us is that people who perceive themselves and who are perceived as being on one side or the other are the ones who report being attacked online as a result of their religion, right? It's not Catholics in the aggregate. It's not white mainline Protestants in the aggregate. It's not, people who are generically unaffiliated in the aggregate. And notice, just as a side note, Protestant would include African-American Protestants. So Pew hasn't broken that group out in this table, but we can conclude that probably some share, of course, of Black Protestants feel that they've been discriminated against online as a result of their religion. But the two important pieces here are really the 29% among white evangelicals and the 21% among atheists. So again, it's this idea of siloization and people who are in one sort of pole being attacked and people who are on the other pole sort of being attacked. Let me then show you. Can you see that whole thing? Super. Here we have, and this is not actual voting numbers, right? Nobody seems to have that quite together yet. But what this shows you is very close to the election. Let's see, September 30 to October 5th of 2020. These are data that Pew collected about presidential preference. And so, all US registered voters, 42 Trump, 52 Biden. Maybe it wasn't quite that big a spread, but that gives you the general idea. Which groups, if we break this down by religious affiliation, which groups were on Trump's side in the aggregate, which groups were on the other side, on Biden's side in the aggregate? Again, white Christians versus everybody else. Again, as I tell my students, there's no such thing as a perfect formula in anything that has to do with human behavior. So it depends, right? Yes, there are 17% of white evangelical Protestants who told Pew they were for Biden. And yes, there were 11%, let's take that for example, of atheists and agnostics who indeed said that they were for Trump. So it's not a perfect relationship, but this gives you the idea. So the question then becomes one of why. Why would this be the case? Why, as a side note, would it not really matter much to most people in 2020 that Joe Biden is Catholic, that Joe Biden is also pretty observant as a Catholic? Compare that, of course, as I'm sure all of you have done in one way or another in your heads, to 1960, when obviously it was a huge deal that JFK was Catholic. So what's happened? What's happened is that the way in which religion and politics, in the sense of electoral politics to begin with, but more broadly as well, the way in which religion and politics intersect in this country has been profoundly altered. However, I don't want anyone to think that up until the emergence of the Christian right, as it was called when it was new, back around 1980, was something that was novel, right? Alexis de Tocqueville observed way back when, right, 1840, based on his travels to the United States. He said, by the side of every religion, or I can't remember the quote now, it's embarrassing. By the side of every religion is connected by affinity, a political standpoint, pretty close to what Tocqueville said. And so it was true then, right? It was true, very much true, that people would think about politics, people would think about the world, perceive the world, form their values around the religious tradition of which they were a part. And in the United States, of course, I'm sure you all are aware that until pretty recently, and arguably even still to this day, the United States hasn't even begun to catch up with the rest of the sort of wealthiest countries in the world in terms of the recession of religion from the public square, right? We're very, very religious for a rich country, incredibly so. And part of the reason for that is because ever since before the founding of the country, we've had a more or less free marketplace in this country when it comes to religion. As a result, people get to go choose, right? For a long time, they would choose based on the religion of their ancestors, the religion of the ethnic groups to which they belonged. That to a certain extent is no longer quite as palpable, but there's always been this idea that, we can sort ourselves out the way we want to. It's our choice, it's our freedom. And so it becomes an important piece of our social identity. We're like, I've chosen to be an observant Muslim. I have chosen to be a Christmas and Easter Catholic. I have chosen to be whatever. And when there ends up being some kind of perception among people that that ability to be what it is that you've chosen to be is somehow threatened, people get all amped up, right? People get all amped up. And when they're amped up, politicians notice. And politicians say, look at this group that's all amped up. Let me go and try and harness that energy for my own political gain. So it's been the case that religion, in the sense of religious affiliation, has connected two different kinds of political movements over the entire course of our country's history. It just so happens to be the case that right now, and arguably since about 1980, the predominant manifestation of how religion connects with politics is that if you're a white Christian, increasingly over time, you're Republican, and increasingly over time, you are conservative around moral issues. Now, again, it's not a perfect thing, but to see Trump in this survey having 78% of the support of white evangelical Protestants, despite the fact that Trump himself is awkward at best with religion, and perhaps not a beacon of morality for all the world, right? These sorts of things didn't matter, right? Didn't matter because I'm a white evangelical Protestant. I perceive that I am being threatened. I am being bullied online. I am looking at the world and I'm seeing things change and it scares me. And as a result, I'm doubling down on support for the party that presents itself as the defender of tradition. And so as the world kind of changes around religion and as religion in particular declines, right? Religious participation and religious affiliation decline in this country. That creates an even greater perception that, who are those people over there? As one of my colleagues suggested before, who are they? They're not me, right? They're different than I am. They're encroaching on what I believe to be the way I want to live my life. And at least for people who are, I want to focus specifically on white Christians in this case, a lot of people who are white Christians would look out at the world and they would say, Christianity's in decline. Not as many people are attending religious services. And as Pew demonstrates in this chart, and it's spread out because they wanted their y-axis to be mathematically correct. And this just goes back to 2007, based on Pew's outstanding data, very highly trustworthy data. In 2007, they found that 78% of the United States population, based on their samples, were Christian, not just white Christian, but any Christian. That number is now, as of 2019, down to 65%. And then meanwhile, unsurprisingly, back in 2007, 16% of Americans were religiously unaffiliated, and that percentage has come close to doubling just in a little bit more than 10 years. Right, so you look at the world, if you are white evangelical Protestant, in the aggregate, you look at the world and you think, oh, all these changes and all these, differences compared to the way I grew up and the way I want to view the world. And people in cities, right? I don't understand them. They don't understand me. People who are people who are Democrats, I don't understand them. They don't understand me. All these kinds of different, right? People who are maybe, if you're a white Protestant, you look at people who are people of color, and you might, if you're not sort of aware of it, think, oh, these are people who are different. These are not people who are like me. And so that sense of threat, right, plays out. And here's my last little slide that I thought you might like to see. This shows you the generation gap in American religion. So it is particularly the case that older white Christians are looking at the world and they are saying, my grandchildren aren't going to church, and that scares me, right? That's sort of a qualitative way of trying to translate these survey data for you. Silent generation, those who were born between 1928 and 1945, as of this same survey you saw before, 2018 to 2019, 84% of those folks are Christian, compared to nominally less than half of millennials. It's extraordinary, right? So there's been this growth in religious disaffiliation, and the bulk of that growth has come among younger folks. Younger folks not only say, I'm unaffiliated, right? And by unaffiliated, what we mean is saying, so in a survey, are you Christian? Are you Jewish? Are you Muslim? Are you Buddhist? And then if I say I'm Jewish, what kind of Jewish are you? If I say I'm Christian, what kind of Christian are you? Blah, blah, blah. Unaffiliated is where people say none of the above, right? They don't even have any kind of, basic, no, I'm not Christian, I'm not this, I'm not any of it. Not surprisingly, younger folks, because they're unaffiliated naturally, so many of them don't attend religious services either. And so what that suggests is that, and a lot of people, when I talk about this sort of thing, they say, well, young people always move away from religion after they grow up in it. And then once they have families, they go back to it. Oh, that's been true for generations. But if you've grown up without it in the first place, what is there to suggest that you might say, oh, I've got kids now, I better go back to, oh, wait, I was never there before. Right? So religion, religious affiliation, religious participation are declining. That means that increasingly people who are deeply committed to religion, whatever form it takes, but most importantly right now for white Christians, increasingly, I think these folks are feeling marginalized, right? Why is it not okay online for me to be a white evangelical Protestant? Why am I being, taunted for that? The sense that I'm not welcome here anymore. Other survey data suggest that white evangelical Protestants in particular are apt to respond yes when asked in surveys, do you feel like a stranger in your own country? Which is not a great survey question. It's pretty leading, but even so, right, even if it's a bad survey question, yes, I feel like a stranger in my own country, right? And so when people wonder, okay, why are evangelical Protestants, white evangelical Protestants in particular, so sort of drawn to Trumpism, to, rather than a more traditional Republican politics, a big piece of that is, hey, Trump is saying, we're going to go back. We're going to make America great again. Right. So what does that suggest? Well, maybe going back to a time when, if you look at the baby boomers and the silent generation, people were religious and people went to worship services. So that there's much, much more that I could share. But you don't want to be here all night. And honestly, as much as I enjoy this, neither do I. So I think I'll go ahead and stop at this point. And if folks have questions, please do ask. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, all the panelists. The floor is open for anybody who might like to ask a question of any of the panelists. You'll have to make sure you do what I forget to do sometimes and unmute yourself. And you can direct it to any or all of the panelists, however you would like to do it. So please, if any of you in the audience would like to ask a question.
I would just like to interject. That was all fascinating knowledge. Those are, I love that there is a split between the three of you in totally different aspects of politics. And just so much stuff I never even thought about. Yeah, so I'm very appreciative, and I would like to thank you guys. As well as everybody's acknowledging Atlantic Institute, I just acknowledge all of you because we could not do this without those that are be willing to come forward and share an evening with us. So I'm just going to mute myself for a second in case anybody has a question. Tracy, I agree with you. It was excellent information. Any comments? I think you might not even have to have a question if there's something that struck you. I never thought about Professor Lasser when you said it's all become a legal question. Like, yeah, that's true. Like, I never thought about it like that. I know I've had conversations in the past with many different faith leaders saying the decline of people, that churches are dying and stuff like that. So it's been very, very interesting. And I'm so appreciative of like the slides and all the information and all the data. This was quite informative. So that's my share for the moment. I'm going to let somebody else share. Let's see, I'm thinking, I don't know if I even know anybody on here from before, but if you'd like to share. Tracy, she said the big question seems to be bridging the first gaps, those between neighbors.
Yeah, I'll try chime in a little, and I really enjoyed listening to my colleagues' presentations, because I think there's ways in which we're each getting at a layer here of this broader political divide. So I'll just quickly say that I'm becoming a little more sociological. I've always been a bit sociological in my work, and I'm looking at this question about the connections between people's perceptions of their neighborhood, how their neighborhood is changing, and ways in which that brings about a degree of civic engagement or disengagement, or as among many, including Eleanor Ostrom, would talk about brilliant length of sort of social capital. But I think in that regard, I think Professor Olsen's presentation about religion has had me also think about this notion around churches, right? And sort of in what ways individuals attend congregations that give them consistent messages and messaging that reinforce other aspects of their social life, right? Many years ago, Dr. Martin Luther King talked about 11 o'clock a.m. on Sunday being the most segregated hour in the United States. And so I think, and fortunately or unfortunately, well, unfortunately, I would say, in many respects, that is still true. And true not just in the sense that, of course, churches represent an opportunity for individuals to come together in ethnic and co-ethnic ethnic communities, but it also does not, to the degree to which we are not seeing, and I know this has actually been an aspect of evangelicalism in the United States, evangelism in the United States around multiracial evangelism. I would be intrigued by Professor Olsen to what degree we don't see these trends within the evangelical movement that go all the way back to the turn of the century around multiracialism at times. And we're seeing sort of these divides just simply reinforce themselves in these congregations.
So a couple quick things to say around this. First of all, the decline. So there's decline in religious affiliation across racial and ethnic groups. So there's some decline among Black folks too, and definitely some decline among Latinx people too. And around the multiracialism. So it's interesting that you couch it as you did perfectly in the context of a century ago, because by far the most important and sort of remarkable manifestation of multiracial, multi-ethnic sort of worship that happens in the US right now occurs within Pentecostalism, which of course is a branch that is housed under that evangelical white. Originally it was sort of white, but then also multiracial. So today, if you want to find a church, a place of worship that's a little bit less segregated, chances are you'll find that in Pentecostal churches. But then there's a lot of politics, like religious politics, that happen within the evangelical community, where some evangelicals don't trust Pentecostals, which, by the way, is one major reason why Pat Robertson didn't get even farther than he did in 1988 in the presidential race, because he is Pentecostal. So a lot of sort of mainstream evangelicals, I don't know about that guy. You also, of course, see some really rich, really beautiful multi-ethnic worship among Muslims, where there's enough places where there's enough Muslims to get enough folks together that that there's a community. So there's that. But then there's also this piece where when you mention churches, right, or places of worship, people who opt in to participating, and this is something that the literature on religion and politics has established reasonably well over a couple decades now, that churches are political communities, right? They're communities in all kinds of senses. But if you go someplace and you, as you were saying, you have messages get repeated, right? Not just from clergy, but from your fellow parishioners, people who sit next to you in the pews. Right, that creates not just a social context within which you part, right? That's part of what you do on a weekly basis, let's say, but it also sort of enhances the importance of your identity as a particular kind of religious person in your sort of hierarchy of social identities. And another piece to this that I was going to mention but forgot, but it's well worth saying. There's been some new research in the last few years, which is super interesting, which suggests that one major reason why we're seeing this sort of uptick in religious disaffiliation is that particularly young people are looking at what they think religion is, and they're seeing it being sort of most publicly attached to conservative politics. And they're saying, if that's what religion is, that's not what I am. And so I'm opting out. So there's been this real crisis. It's something that I've looked at, in dribs and drabs over a period of time, this crisis in progressive Christianity in this country. If you're someone who wants to see progressive Christianity be a thing. It was a thing, right? It was a very big, very important thing mid last century through about the Vietnam era. Not anymore, right? So
we had a question from Ruth that came in. She said, Dr. Olsen, could you talk about / define evangelical, in what characteristics are at the forefront?
Right. Great question. So when we think about Protestantism, and there are many, many shades of gray, but for purposes of argument, for purposes of survey data analysis, we think about Protestantism, we think about three categories: African American, which is its own separate tradition, its own separate, as Dr. Shaw was saying, its own separate set of denominations and churches. Secondly, mainline Protestantism, which is sort of theologically and politically more or less progressive and rooted in sort of the old big churches with capital C, going back to the early days of the Republic. So United Methodists are considered mainline Protestants. Presbyterian Church USA, as opposed to Presbyterian Church America, are considered mainline Protestants. The Episcopal Church, mainline Protestant, etc. I could get further down in the weeds, but you don't want that. And third, we have Evangelical Protestants. Evangelical Protestantism implies a few things, one of which is a very strict, and this is not to say that other Christians aren't strict in their interpretation of Scripture. Many Black Protestants, for instance, are, but a very strict interpretation of Scripture. The sort of essential importance of, as an adult or as a old enough kid that you can think for yourself, accepting Jesus Christ as one's personal savior. Like, yes, I believe that Jesus died for my sins, and I'm going to go publicly testify to that. And the term evangelical refers to the imperative in this tradition to go spread the good word, right? So you don't run into, for example, Catholics very often who are inviting you to come to Mass. Or in the tradition I grew up in, which was the more progressive mainline Protestantism, we never really invited somebody to come along, right? Likewise in Judaism, it's just really, folks are welcome, right? But it's just not done. Evangelical Protestantism, with some of that theology actually being held, shared in common with Black Protestantism, on the other hand, there's this really kind of big expectation that you're going to go out and you're going to share the good news with others, right? So, and that's one reason why Evangelical Protestantism has thrived, because people go ask you to come, right? If nobody invites you, you're not going to go. And in Evangelical Protestantism, you get invited, and sometimes, right, those invitations are answered. So, and there are other, like, lot of other shades of gray, but at the end of the day, it's intensely individualistic manifestation of Christianity. And it's also this sort of very deep, profound desire to go and convert other people and to bring them into the fold, as it were. And a very strict, or rather hierarchical, so a strict interpretation of Scripture and a hierarchical relationship between the pastor and the congregation.
Very good, thank you. I think I might have, that was a very good question. I don't think I actually knew that as well. Any other questions?
I want to get back to the question on neighbors that I think Tracy asked, in the sense that, so to kind of unpack this question about neighbors and neighborhoods, and that's partly what my current work is trying to unpack, in the sense that individual sense of their community is different than their neighborhood, right? And so even though I've spent a lot of time in my presentation talking about residential segregation, or, there are ways in which, given now COVID-19 and the pandemic is changing a lot about our social fabric, or might be. Well, stay tuned for us to really understand all of this. But the degree to which we have such social mobility, and I mean social mobility not only in the opportunity and class sense, but we literally move as Americans. For instance, I'm studying the city of Atlanta, partly with some colleagues, partly because Atlanta has a lot of auto mobility. In order to get from point A to point B, you hop in your car. You don't, your church is not within walking distance, your school's not within walking distance. And those things haven't been true for decades, but it's even more so the case that individuals spend a lot of time outside their neighborhood in the normal sense of things. So from one perspective, that means that there's aspects to which this notion of neighborhood is undergoing fairly dramatic changes, but neighborhoods still matter. When we look at these questions around sort of urban planning, questions around economic development and gentrification of neighborhoods, people still have some strong identity. The one survey set of results we got from an Atlanta survey was that we found a sort of and this was back in 2015 when we did the survey, we found that individuals have a strong sense of connection to their neighborhood, but they don't know their neighbors very well. And so on one regard, in one regard, then I want to kind of keep open this idea that it's really about sort of the social connections, the meeting in church congregations, the degree to which you're connected through civic groups, that are all the other ways that might reinforce, reinforce or cut against the grain of these divisions that we see. But more and more as political scientists, we're saying, and this goes back to the work of, I can think back at least to the work of Carmeans and Stimson around issue evolution, that the idea since the 1980s, there's this sort of political consistency of what is a Democrat and what is a Republican, right? In the sense that the racial and economic conservatives are Republican, the racial and economic conservatives, liberals are Democrats. We know, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, Southern Democrats crossed some lines here, and so that party identification is now more consistent. Democrats a more consistent label for those things on the liberal side, and Republican, the more consistent label on the conservative side. So I think, I said all that to say that I think this is a complex question about who's our neighbor, Tracy. But I will say that local engagement matters, and local engagement around the degree to which people build a sense of community across these differences matter. So in one respects, neighborhoods are changing, but neighbors still matter. Sorry, that's a long way to answer that question.
Can I just say, I think when you talk, all of our conversations with our neighbors don't have to be political, or it's perhaps better for them to start out not being political.
Absolutely.
There's actually, I think, a lot of common ground that people across these divides share, but they're typically not things that we think of as sort of purely political, right? And I think to the specific question of what can we do, I think one of the things is to start out trying to find that common ground. I don't say this really as a political scientist, but just, maybe there's something we do agree on. We want our kids to be successful and well, and we want our neighborhood to look nice, or whatever it might be. And you find some common ground, and then you find that maybe, you're not as different. Maybe we're not exaggerating those differences. So kind of breaking that cycle a little bit, I think is important.
So very true. I'm trying to scroll up for a second. I think Tracy said in here, further suggestions to quit polarizing politics. And I think some of that was discussed in kind of finding common ground or things like that. And I think for a lot of us, it's stop listening to media. I think sometimes, the media really does its best job to try to polarize the two sides, all the issues.
Or I would add in there, Christina, having an informed lens when you listen.
Yes. Yes. There you go. There you go. Yes. I know. I'm one of the ones that I very rarely, I don't share anything political on my social media pages, my personal ones. And I'm always very cautious reading anybody else's, or I don't even, because most of them are not legitimate good sources. And so that's why we've had dialogue discussions in the past about social media and its influences as well, just to make sure we alarm people and alert people. I know usually we try to end at 8:30, and this was a very good discussion and there was a lot of information. Any last thoughts or questions? I was gonna say, Scott, do you have anything to add in wrapping up?
I was going to.
Well, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, Scott. I'm taking this out of order as a panelist, but I was going to ask you, as a moderator, your view about the coming back around to your advocacy versus listening question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's an old point. It's something Socrates said at his trial. At the beginning of the trial, he opens up and says, you know, those lawyers, they gave such a great speech. I almost forgot who I was. You know, the prosecutors. And he said, but as for truth, there's not one word of truth in what they said. And I think, and it's something that comes up repeatedly in Plato's dialogues, the idea that if you're engaging in a conversation to try to win an argument as opposed to understand the truth, right, you will lose the truth in the search, and you'll have no good relation with the people you're talking to. And in the Republic, there's a character named Thrasymachus who is kind of he has an agenda, right? He comes in, it says he comes in like a wild beast, trying to dominate the conversation, right? We've all sort of, met people like that. Maybe we've succumbed to that ourselves. We get so caught up in the heat of the moment, and you want to make a point and you want to make sure they get it, but you forget that that you don't know everything yourself, and maybe you need more of an exchange, and maybe none of us has a God's eye view, right? I mean, there's always something we don't know that we haven't considered, and so it's just kind of it's kind of a style of engagement and conversation. And I mean, I would say there's a time and a place for advocacy, right? I mean when you go into the voting booth, you're not you're making a decision. I'm definitely voting for this person, and there's no discussion anymore. But you'll be better off if there was a lot of discussion before that, I think, right? Just the mentality of not treating people as opponents to defeat, right? But as, maybe to use that word, neighbors, in a sense, in a loose sense, that you either persuade or be persuaded by, and you let that be an ongoing process of exchange. So, I mean, I would reiterate Dr. Lasser's point there. I mean, he said something similar. Just, I can't remember exactly what I have in mind, but he said something that was right along what I was thinking about. I kind of lost it, but I guess that's what I had in mind.
Very good. Very good discussion. And I know that this could even go on and on, just because there's so much to learn and draw from. But I want to make sure I'm respectful of everybody's time. And thank you all for being here. I want to share my screen real quick and just share, this is my plug for Saturday. Saturday, one of the things we've started is, because there's not a lot of information about what's going on in the rest of the world, we have this event on Saturday that's from local to global, and it's we're connecting with another organization in South Africa, and we have two speakers from the US, from South Carolina, Dr. Adrian Bird, that some are familiar with, and Dr. Catherine Fleming Bruce. And then we have two speakers from South Africa that are going to be joining us. This is a former broadcast journalist, and then I believe he is also a writer as well, and he's, I think, very well knowledgeable, and he's from Johannesburg, South Africa. So one of the things that we're doing this year is we're taking, so if you are interested, you can sign up over here, just so you know, and it is 12 o'clock for lunchtime on Saturday, because it's 7 p.m. South African Standard Time. So I just want to make sure that you guys are aware that we have that event coming up, and that is coming out of the fact that there's sometimes not a very good accurate knowledge of how things are on the other side of the world. and how things are in the different countries that we're on, that we're all on this earth together. And so just to start to learn and share from each other. But I would like to thank you all. Those of you that are joining us tonight, if you want to unmute yourself and you can say thank you or good evening, feel free to.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lily. We appreciate you all being here. And this is recorded, so you can watch this on YouTube. It's also been streaming on Facebook Live. So you can share from there if you need to as well.
Right.
All right. Thank you for joining us, Judy.
I enjoyed it a whole lot. Learned a lot, as a matter of fact.
Yes.
A lot
Thank
of
you.
ways to think of things that I never had thought before. And I especially appreciate your definition of what evangelical was. That, I mean, we throw that word around all the time, and you made
Yes.
it exactly clear, so I know what we're saying when we talk about evangelical.
I'm glad. Thank
Yeah.
you.
I appreciate it. I think we throw these words around pretending we all know what they are.
Yeah.
For sure. All right. So thank you guys. I want to thank everybody, and I'm going to go ahead and.
All right.
All right, thank you for
Thank you. Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
everyone.
Everybody.